And we move on to the next part of today's agenda, and that's the presentation by Matthew Conway. Matthew is a colleague of mine. He is Director of Public and Regulatory Policy. And I am going to say that he's the author of this report. I know he's going to be trying to be very modest about it, but I think without Matthew, we wouldn't have the report sitting in front of us. So I'm really grateful to Matthew for coming up today again. He came up to the Scottish Parliament event too, so very grateful for his support. And he's going to give you the detailed report. So Matthew, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Vicky. It's nothing to do with modesty. Honestly, other people did write large parts of this. So I'm going to canter through the report. Nothing I'm about to say isn't in there. So on the one hand, if you have read it and you're prepared to take the test afterwards, feel free to go and do something else. However, if you stay, I won't interpret that as meaning you didn't read it and you're therefore hoping to get a very quick introduction so that you can ask intelligent questions afterwards. So the structure of this presentation very much follows the report, which is brief introduction, quick rehearsal of why availability matters. I think we all know that, but it's important not to lose the core purpose for doing any work in this area. Some statistics, without which all of these discussions lack an evidence base. And then we talk a lot about the role of markets, the role of intervention, and make some findings and some observations. A lot of this is not rocket science. A lot of this has been said before and has been said in many different ways by many different people. But I think in compiling this report, we were acutely aware that, to the best of our knowledge, nobody had ever, in one place, in hopefully reasonably accessible language, addressed the questions that this report tackles, which is, what are the facts about the availability of communication services? Why are they what they are, and what can anybody do about them? So this is a report that is very deliberately aimed at policymakers and attempts to inform those sorts of debate. Parts of that debate are for us to take forward, parts of that are debate for others to consider. So why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? It's an important issue, but it doesn't mean that Ofcom has to deal with it. Well, three key reasons. We've got duties to promote the interests of citizens and consumers in the UK. We have duties to secure the widespread availability of high-quality communication services, and we have to have regard to the different interests of different parts of the UK, different ethnic communities, and the different interests of urban and rural dwellers. So the law pretty much tells us we have to care about this, and that's as good a reason to do something as any. We have focused on what you might call core communication services, so fixed telephony, fixed broadband, mobile, broadcasting, and post. There are other services that sort of branch off from that, but that's the starting point. And we very much focused on availability. This is essentially about whether you can get a service. That doesn't mean that whether you are able to afford that service, whether you take it up, whether you know how to use it and get the best out of it, aren't important. They're clearly critical. Lawns mention that. But there are other agencies, including ourselves, who deal with those issues. That's a different set of questions, not for this report. So just, I think, important to recognise we've deliberately kept the focus of this quite narrow. At the heart of this is population density, and I just really quite like this map. This is a picture from space, from the Campaign to Protect Rural England. It's the map of light pollution in the United Kingdom. And of course, the message is that where there are people, there are lights, but therefore, by extension, where there aren't people, it's dark, and that's probably where your challenges are likely to be most significant. I had the joy last night of explaining to my children that there weren't 1,000 islands in the North Sea, but those were oil rigs. I then had to show them what oil rigs were and ended up in a very long conversation. But fundamentally, this is the map that tells you why this entire report makes sense. If it was all the same colour, we wouldn't be needing to have quite the same discussion. The other thing, just to say by way of introduction, is that the data in this report are not new. They're all drawn from our communications market reports and our infrastructure report. What they do for the first time is attempt to look at those data through the lens of rurality. And we've essentially divided the UK up into urban, semi-urban, if we'd called them peri-urban, Thomas would be so much happier, and rural locations. And we've done it by the 12 EU statistical classification regions of the UK. So the data that are published in the report are Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and the 9 English regions. We have those data at more granular levels. We'll come back to what might be possible with those data later on, but everything that's in here is based on that classification. And again, I start off just by sort of stressing the importance of rurality to the whole of this discussion. The way that we carved up the UK shows that even England is overwhelmingly rural as far as landmass is concerned. Only 18% of England is urban or semi-urban. But in that context, the 89 and 93% of Wales and Northern Ireland and the 97% of Scotland that by landmass is rural puts a lot of this into context. But then if you look at this by population, you get a slightly different story, where, yes, England is still overwhelmingly the most urbanised part of the United Kingdom, with 87% of its population living in urban or semi-urban locations. But Scotland, with 83%, 82%, is also quite urbanised as far as population is concerned, and it's Wales and Northern Ireland that have the greater issues in terms of dispersion of population. And that therefore brings out one of the key issues here, which is the tension between where people live and where people can go. And in communication services in particular, which are not just fixed but also mobile, that's two very different sets of factors to try and consider at the same time. I won't spend very long on why availability matters, partly because I'd be preaching to converted, and partly because when I did this presentation at the Scottish Parliament, I took twice as long as I was supposed to. So in the interest of time, I largely hope that we can all take it as read that availability does matter. I think the two things in particular that I would bring out are, first of all, our stress in this report that actually it's the internet that really matters. Other communication services are, of course, very, very important, but the benefits that the internet brings, the growth in their significance, and in particular, the potential disbenefit for those who don't have access to the internet, the potential of a digital divide between the haves and the have-nots, makes the internet absolutely critical. And that sort of leads into the second point, which is where public services in particular are moving online and in due course may move online exclusively. Public authorities responsible for those public services fundamentally cannot ignore the implications for those who do not have access to the internet. Those, I think, are just the two key points that I would dwell on as far as those issues are concerned. So then, some boring statistics, which are in the report, but we'll present just a little bit differently here for interest's sake. So just to get sort of a factual grounding of what the UK looks like in terms of availability. Fixed telephony is very straightforward. There is a universal service. It's set at the UK level, determined through Europe as well. BT reported that more than 99.75% of all the requests it had to deliver universal services were under the threshold that it sets for reasonable cost, and in fact it had fulfilled more than 99.9% of requests for access to universal telephone services. And Kingston Communications in Kingston upon Hull has apparently never turned down a request for connection. So fixed telephony, I think we can reasonably assume, is relatively well served at the moment. Standard broadband, by which, for the purposes of this report, we mean real access to at least 2 megabits per second broadband, is also not bad. And in the graphs that follow, you'll just about be able to make out a very small number of little green squares around some numbers and quite a large number of red squares around numbers. And what those indicate is that on the basis that we decided to adopt in this report, those numbers are statistically significantly better or worse than the UK average. So as far as standard broadband is concerned, Scotland pretty much on a par with the UK. The one thing that actually stands out is that in rural locations, standard broadband availability is actually better and statistically significantly better than rural UK locations as a whole. Doesn't mean the job is completed, but that's a pattern that's interesting, particularly when you contrast it with superfast broadband, where in both urban and semi-urban locations, the availability of superfast broadband in Scotland is appreciably worse than it is in the UK as a whole. Now, it's worth noting that the reason that the UK numbers are as high as they are is largely because they're dragged up enormously by Greater London and Northern Ireland. So there's a slight statistical sleight of hand in operation here, and that's why the 6.3% of rural Scottish availability isn't actually much worse than the UK as a whole, because the 21% is 90-something for Greater London and for Northern Ireland, and not very much at all for the other 10 nuts regions of the United Kingdom. So obviously an evolving picture. These statistics are already out of date, even though they were the most current ones that we had to date. That's the picture that's moving most quickly, and we would expect all of those bars to increase in all locations over time. that map sort of shows you how the world looks, and it's interesting not because it looks a lot like the light pollution map, but because there's a fairly clear distinction here between what the market has done and what state intervention has done. I'll come back to that later, but essentially Great Britain equals market, Northern Ireland equals state, and that's a very stark message. And Lorne is absolutely right to point out Highlands and Islands' leading position within Scotland. It won't surprise you that the Northern Ireland Department for Enterprise, Trade and Investment is quite keen to point out just where it stands in the UK pecking order when it comes to making superfast broadband available. So there's a message that lies behind that map. And then the next map also shows, I think, a very interesting picture. First of all, there's nothing special about the UK. If you are in a rural location, you have poor connectivity. That's not good for you. If you are in a political region with lots of rural areas, then you clearly face more rural issues than other locations. But to an extent, rural is rural, whether you're in the United Kingdom, Italy, or Greece. If you are small, you have a high population density, and you've had cable for a very long time, like the Benelux countries, surprise, surprise, you've probably got near 100% superfast broadband availability already. You can see some countries where that's clearly not the case. The UK is one, Scandinavia is another, Spain's quite interesting. Clearly something beyond the market is pushing availability in some locations. And then I just think it's interesting to pause on France and Italy. France, because for a country that's traditionally quite open to state intervention, availability doesn't perhaps look quite as good as you'd imagine. And I think the picture in Italy pretty much tells its own story. I'm not sure what's going on in Italy, other than it's probably not as much as many Italians would probably like to see. So moving on to mobile, again, when it comes to 2G mobile and premises where there's at least one operator, the story across the United Kingdom is pretty uniform, very high levels of availability. Okay, technically, rural Scotland is statistically worse than rural the rest of the United Kingdom, but these are very, very high levels of availability. And when it comes to questions of proportionality and intervention, maybe this isn't necessarily where you would focus your attention. Again, the story changes a bit when you move to 3G. Scotland, slightly worse on a premises basis than the rest of the UK, but interestingly, not particularly significantly so from a statistical perspective. But then you move away from premises and you look at landmass, and for both 2G and 3G, and this brings out the tension between where people live and where people go, availability of services throughout the landmass of Scotland is appreciably worse than it is for the UK as a whole, and it's particularly poor for 3G. Less than half of Scotland's landmass has at least one operator delivering a 3G signal. So big challenges there where you're talking about parts of Scotland where you want people to have access to 3G services, but people do not live. Move on through some of the other services. Delivery of public service broadcasting through the DTT Freeview platform. Again, very homogeneous across the United Kingdom. I should say at this point that obviously you can also get digital television through satellite, which is, I think Sky have reported that they're able to install equipment at 98+% of all premises that ask for it. And of course, if you've got cable, you can get TV through cable. If you've got broadband, you can get IPTV. But digital terrestrial, given how important it is in the United Kingdom, those figures, again, look pretty consistent. Less consistent when you look at the commercial DTT services, which aren't available on all multiplexes. Again, statistically, Scotland not that much worse than the United Kingdom as a whole. Indeed, slightly better in urban locations, and it's rural that lags. But that's a pattern that, if I were to show you the map for the English regions, you would see replicated. So Scotland doesn't stand out enormously. As far as radio is concerned, analog radio is pretty ubiquitous, and of course you can get digital radio where you get Freeview and where you have the internet. So we focused on DAB. DAB slightly lagging in urban Scotland, but pretty comparable in semi-urban and rural locations as far as BBC services are concerned. Not quite as good where access to the commercial services on the Digital One multiplex are concerned. Scotland is lagging, and a particularly poor level of availability in rural locations. And then one of the key drivers for radio, of course, is whether you can listen to it in the car, and much like 3G and 2G mobile, you find the situation in Scotland is much worse when it comes to landmass coverage, with barely 40% of the Scottish landmass having commercial DAB reception, and barely half of Scotland having BBC services on DAB. Then finally, post, as with telephony, there is a universal service. There's been one for a very long time. There are a very few exceptions, but essentially Royal Mail services 99.99% of all UK addresses and has done for a very long time. So those are the raw facts, which we thought were worth bringing out in that way so that debates about these issues at least proceed from a reasonably consistent and understood evidence base. The starting point for explaining them is, of course, markets. And again, I'd hope nobody around this table would disagree too strongly that markets are usually the best starting point for delivering services on a widespread and efficient basis. And that's essentially because competitive markets drive down prices, so you get neither undersupply nor oversupply, and competition tends to drive down costs, increase innovation, and promote low prices. But, and even Ofcom says the but, markets are not perfect. There are lots of reasons why markets don't work, particularly in network industries like communications. You often have very high fixed costs that are simply the same whether you're serving 1 million people or 1,000 people. Networks tend to have large positive externalities, benefits to people who are not those involved in a specific transaction. So if Vicky and I are the only two people on a telephone network, that's great. If Kyla joins, it's good for Kyla. Actually, it's good for me and Vicky as well, because we now get to call Kyla. Some of those externalities need to be recognised if you're going to have an efficient delivery system, and the market doesn't always do so. You can have pricing inflexibility, and market power is always a problem, and particularly in industries where you have long-established state monopolies, and the legacy of that is still with us in communications and drives a lot of what we do. So there are reasons why markets don't work, and even where markets do work, local factors will always determine whether the market thinks it's worth delivering a service there. The more people you have in a location, the more educated they are, the more they earn, the lower the mountains, the smaller the distances between settlements, and the cost of providing those services all determine ultimately whether the market will decide it's worthwhile to drive services out to a particular location. And I've just pulled out a few examples from the report to illustrate that. So this shows you the average number of mobile cell sites by density of population. You start at the left, you've got the most dispersed, least dense parts of the United Kingdom. Unsurprisingly, you need lots of mobile masts to cover them, simply because there are large distances between the people that you want to reach. As your population gets more dense and you head right along the graph, you need fewer and fewer masts. And then, perhaps initially paradoxically, but not, when things get really dense, you start needing more masts, simply because you need to be able to carry so much more data that you simply need more masts to pick it up. But that's one illustration that says the less dense your population, the more infrastructure you're going to need. Second illustration, which picks that up, is how the UK's DTT network reaches the population. 80 masts in the United Kingdom reach 90% of the population. To reach the next 8.5%, you need a further 1,080 relays, and that is the UK's DTT network. So the tail on this hockey stick is an extremely long tail indeed, and it's worth noting, therefore, that consecutive governments, UK governments, have explicitly decided that the 1.5% of the population who never got analogue terrestrial television and do not get digital terrestrial television are simply not proportionate to be served. This is the coverage pattern that is set out in operators' licences at the UK government's behest. So the definition of universal is not universal by definition. And then finally, a map that goes down really well in Wales, as you can imagine. Those little crosses are the 12 transmitters that deliver real radio FM to 1.3 million adults in the south of Wales. On the next map, that one cross is the one transmitter that delivers heart to 2.3 million people in Birmingham. So again, an illustration of how different topography, different population densities drive infrastructure. All is, however, not lost if you live in an area that the market will not serve. As Lorne has picked up, as Vicky mentioned earlier, the state can intervene, the state does intervene, and even in a service that we think of as being perhaps one of the more competitively delivered ones, the state has consistently intervened in the delivery of communication services pretty much from the year dot. As you all know, the state intervenes for lots of reasons, typically to improve outcomes for society, and largely because there are positive externalities that the market won't recognise, or because market power means that fewer people will get a service than they really should. It's also worth remembering that intervention usually comes at a cost, and therefore, first of all, you need to be very clear that your intervention is not going to be worse than the problem that you're trying to solve. Secondly, you need to check that the costs of your intervention aren't going to outweigh the benefits. And third, it's important to ask yourself whether the implications for public expenditure or taxation are worth the specific intervention that you have in mind. There are generally no free lunches when it comes to state provision. And of course, the state sometimes chooses to over-provide for social and political objectives, and those are legitimate decisions for politicians to make, because that is, after all, why we elect them. Various reasons are various ways that states can intervene. The state can intervene by buying services that the market won't provide otherwise, by requiring the provision of services, by helping the market come to the right decision on its own, and then slightly awkwardly in this schema, sometimes communities themselves get together and come up with solutions that wouldn't otherwise have arisen. And in terms of intervention in practice, and I'll come on to a couple of examples in a moment, there are some key purposes. One is just to get the market to do what it was going to do, but to do it quite a bit quicker. Secondly, and perhaps the usual one, is to get the market to do more than it otherwise would. Sometimes you're trying to mimic the effects of competition. There are some other purposes as well. Finally here, it's worth noting the implications of our membership of the European Union, and we are still members of the European Union. And it matters in two ways. First of all, of course, one of the principal purposes of the common market, of the single market, is to ensure that member states don't unfairly favour their own producers. So the state aid rules are there for a very real reason, and they are at the core of the single market. But the European Commission has its own objectives, particularly when it comes to the rollout of broadband. And there are interesting tensions where the European Commission itself faces the dilemma of the restrictions that its own state aid rules impose, when at the very same time state intervention is going to be necessary to achieve its own rollout targets. But they absolutely cannot be ignored in terms of planning any interventions. So a few examples of those. Our decision to impose a rollout obligation on one of the winners of 4G spectrum earlier in the year. At least 98% of the UK population must get an indoor mobile broadband service. At least 95% of the population of each nation of the UK, which in practice probably means 98 to 99% outdoor coverage where people live. A very explicit obligation to get the market where it might ultimately have reached, but a lot quicker than it might otherwise have done so. It's a subtle nuance, but it's worth stressing this is not an obligation that takes the market further than we think it would have gone. It's an obligation that takes the market much more quickly to where we think it would have got in the first place. Where the market wouldn't have reached is perhaps exemplified by Sweden's beauty contest for its 3G licenses a decade or so ago, where it took a very explicit approach to requiring coverage of areas that the market simply would never have reached as part of its award of those spectrum licenses. Lorne's mentioned Community Broadband Scotland. There's the Broadband for the Rural North initiative in Lancashire around the Lune Valley, which is a community-based solution to get fibre where acting individually residents and businesses probably wouldn't have secured that. We regulate explicitly the price of Royal Mail's second-class stamps in an attempt to mimic the kind of competition and competitive pressures that might apply in a competitive market. And finally, not only is it a really nice picture of a 1960s post bus, but the post bus service, to the extent it still survives in the UK, is an interesting example of the provision of a communication service that has a spillover effect into another sector entirely, public transport. There aren't many of those examples. We're glad we found one. So, what are the findings? What does this all mean, apart from lots of worthy analysis and statistics from Ofcom? Well, I think it's important to say that communication services in the UK their availability is good in urban locations in all four nations. That's an important starting point. Rural locations are less well served. That is true in England outside Greater London. I haven't given you the English breakdowns here. They're in the report. Outside Greater London, England is very diverse indeed. I live in Hampshire, which you would think is not a million miles away from the nerve centre. I got my letter recently telling me I wouldn't be getting superfast broadband but for Hampshire County Councils and the UK government's funding. So that put me in my place. It is nonetheless true that across the board there is a generally greater and recurring lack of availability in Scotland and Wales, and particularly in Northern Ireland, which of the 4 nations of the UK comes out consistently worst. And a lot of those results persist when availability is analysed by rurality. So it's not just about how rural you are, there are some other factors at play. We did a little bit of finger in the air, and we estimated the number of homes that we thought couldn't get either standard broadband or 3G mobile, so essentially don't get access to the internet in a meaningful way. Of the 49,000 homes in the UK, 48,000 of them are in rural locations, and of the 8,500 premises in Scotland, not a single one of them is not in a rural location. So that just drives home the extent to which this is a rural issue that affects everybody. I will note that of those 49,000 homes in the UK, more than half of them are in Northern Ireland. Some more observations. Market-led rollout, of course, reflects differences in population size, density, composition, topography. You should expect that, and those who discuss these issues should perhaps remember that when they speak. There's an interesting issue in Northern Ireland where nothing that we can analyse suggests why 3G is as poor as it is in Northern Ireland. Instead, there seem to be political factors at play associated with stricter planning laws, a general greater community opposition to masts, and the way that those have interacted with network operators' rollout plans. So something different is happening in Northern Ireland, but it's the only part of the UK where we couldn't explain it through those other factors. And universal service obligations clearly deliver, but at some cost in terms of either higher prices or taxation. What does all that mean in terms of some observations? Well, unsurprisingly, if you've not got something in the past, you're probably not going to get it in the future. This isn't random, it repeats and it recurs. But the flip side of that is, it is possible to anticipate that things will not be available in the same places that didn't get them in the past. And if interventions could be planned at a sufficiently early stage, it is possible not always to have to play catch-up with the rest of the United Kingdom. And it's worth saying, superfast broadband availability in Northern Ireland is the absolutely standout example of that in the UK. Those interventions have been around for ages in communications markets. There's nothing novel or contentious about this. What is different is that the gap between a service becoming available and calls for it to be universally available are shrinking. There wasn't actually a universal service in telecoms written in law until 2003. It always happened, but it was never legislated until 2003. Nonetheless, telephones were around for a very long time before anybody really thought it was necessary to formally say this. In contrast, we put an obligation on one of the 4G operators before they were offering any 4G services. So we're now at the stage where the requirement for widespread availability is being required by the state before the service has even started. EU state aid rules and targets also need to be borne in mind because they can sometimes conflict. And sustainability and value for money is simply becoming increasingly challenging, and no public authority, of course, can choose to ignore those factors. That basically means that the focus on careful targeting to ensure value for money without distorting competition has never been greater. And then finally, there are lots of players in this space. The frameworks for universal availability undoubtedly remain best set by elected representatives. It is their job, it is what they are for. And those representatives absolutely must, as I started off by saying, recognise the increasing dependency on communication services, and for those who don't have availability, the disadvantage that they suffer as things move exclusively online. That's not to say that we as Ofcom don't have our own role. We have an important role as the keeper of the facts, as an advisor to political authorities in the United Kingdom, and as a decision maker in many areas. But fundamentally, our powers don't enable us to secure the widespread availability of every service in every circumstance. So while we as the regulator have a key role to play, we are part of a broader public sector that needs to look at these things collectively and with everybody recognising the role that they have to play. Finally, this isn't a consultation, but we're not saying that that report ends discussion, analysis and research on the issue. We would be very interested in any future observations or research that others do. Our suggestion is that that's routed through our directors in the nations, and of course for Scotland it's Vicky. So I'm sure she'll be delighted if anybody were to follow this up in any way.